The military coup. This is one of the oldest and most direct ways a leader falls from power. It happens when the armed forces, or a faction within them, decide to remove a sitting government by force, or the credible threat of force. The leader is typically placed under arrest, put on a plane out of the country, or in the worst cases, killed. What makes coups distinctive is that they bypass any legal or democratic process entirely. The military simply decides the government is over. This has happened across Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and parts of Asia dozens of times in the 20th century alone. Sometimes it follows genuine public disorder. Other times it is driven purely by the ambitions of generals who want power for themselves. The pattern tends to repeat in countries where civilian institutions are weak, and the military has historically seen itself as a guardian of national order rather than a servant of elected government. The popular uprising. Sometimes a leader falls not because of a rival within the system, but because the population itself reaches a breaking point. Crowds fill the streets, protests grow too large to suppress, and eventually the security forces either refuse to fire on their own people or simply cannot contain the scale of what is happening. The leader, suddenly stripped of the loyalty that kept them in place, has no remaining options. The Arab Spring of 2010 and 2011 produced several examples in quick succession, with leaders in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen all losing power within months of each other. What varies is how the end actually arrives. Some leaders flee, some are captured, some negotiate a transition. The common thread is that the social contract between ruler and ruled has collapsed completely and visibly. The electoral defeat. This one looks peaceful on the surface, and often it is. A leader runs for re-election, loses, and leaves office. In healthy democracies, this is so routine that it barely registers as a downfall at all. But for many leaders who have held power for a long time, an electoral defeat can feel genuinely catastrophic, especially when they have come to see their position as inseparable from their identity. The difficulty arises when a leader refuses to accept the result. History has seen plenty of cases where a losing leader claims fraud, delays the transition, or tries to use remaining institutional levers to reverse the outcome. In those cases, what begins as a normal democratic process tips into something more dangerous. The question of whether a leader will accept electoral defeat has become one of the defining tests of democratic health in the modern era. The assassination. A leader's life ends suddenly by the hand of a person or group who decided that killing them was the only way to change the political direction. Assassination has shaped history in ways that are almost impossible to fully measure. The killing of Archduke Franz Ferdinand helped trigger the First World War. The assassination of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo altered the trajectory of an entire continent. The murders of John F. Kennedy, Anwar Sadat, Yitzhak Rabin, and Benazir Bhutto each sent shockwaves through their countries and beyond. What drives assassinations varies widely, from political ideology and religious extremism to personal grievance and foreign interference. Some assassinations achieve their intended political effect. Many do not, and the killed leader is often elevated into a symbol more powerful than they were in life. Corruption exposure. Leaders have fallen throughout history when the gap between their public image and their private conduct became impossible to bridge. The exposure might involve financial corruption, sexual misconduct, abuse of power, or the unraveling of a carefully constructed lie. What triggers the fall is rarely the scandal alone. It is usually the combination of the scandal and the loss of the political support that had previously insulated the leader. Lula da Silva in Brazil was imprisoned after corruption investigations, though he later returned to political life. Park Geun-hye of South Korea was impeached and imprisoned following a scandal involving a longtime confidant who had used her relationship with the president to extract favors from major corporations. The public's tolerance for corruption varies enormously by country and political culture, but there is almost always a threshold, and when a leader crosses it visibly enough, the consequences arrive. The resignation under pressure. There are moments when a leader still technically holds power, but the circumstances have become so untenable that continuing is no longer realistic. Scandal, military failure, economic collapse, the collapse of a governing coalition, or the open withdrawal of support from key allies can all push a leader toward the door without anyone physically forcing them out. Richard Nixon's resignation in 1974 is perhaps the most studied example of this pattern. He left office not because he was removed by a vote, but because it became clear that the votes to remove him existed and were coming. Harold Macmillan resigned after the Profumo scandal damaged his government beyond repair. Leaders in parliamentary systems face this dynamic regularly when they lose the confidence of their own party. The decision to resign is rarely made freely. It is usually the least bad option among very bad ones. Coup from within the party. Not all coups are military. Sometimes the people who remove a leader are their own political allies, the inner circle, the cabinet, the party leadership. The target does not see it coming in the same way because the threat comes from trusted faces. Margaret Thatcher was removed from the British Prime Ministership not by voters and not by the opposition, but by members of her own Conservative Party who had decided she had become an electoral liability. Geoffrey Howe's resignation speech in Parliament is widely credited as the act that made her removal inevitable. Similar dynamics played out when Nikita Khrushchev was ousted by colleagues within the Soviet Politburo while he was on holiday in 1964. The lesson in these cases is that proximity to power does not guarantee loyalty, and the people closest to a leader are sometimes the ones best positioned to end their time in office. The revolution. A revolution goes further than an uprising. It does not just remove a specific leader. It dismantles the entire political order that the leader represented and attempts to replace it with something fundamentally different. The French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Iranian Revolution, and the Cuban Revolution all followed variations of this pattern. The leader in question, whether a monarch, a president, or a prime minister, becomes a symbol of the old world. Their removal is not just political, it is ideological. What comes next is uncertain and often violent. Revolutions have a way of consuming not just their original targets, but many of the people who led them. Robespierre, who helped drive the Reign of Terror in France, was himself guillotined. Leon Trotsky, one of the architects of the Russian Revolution, was eventually hunted down and killed on Stalin's orders in Mexico City. War Crime Tribunal. In the 20th and 21st centuries, a new mechanism emerged for ending the careers and freedoms of leaders who committed atrocities while in power. International tribunals, established after World War II at Nuremberg and then again in the 1990s for Yugoslavia and Rwanda, created a framework in which former heads of state could be prosecuted for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. Slobodan Milosevic died in custody at The Hague while his trial was still ongoing. Charles Taylor of Liberia became the first former head of state convicted by an international tribunal since Nuremberg. The International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for sitting and former leaders in Africa, Europe, and beyond. What this mechanism represents is the slow, contested, and imperfect idea that power does not grant immunity from accountability. Constitutional term limit. This is perhaps the quietest and most orderly form of a leader's downfall, if it can even be called that. The law simply says that a person may serve for a fixed number of terms, and when those terms are complete, they must leave. The United States formalized this with the 22nd Amendment in 1951, following Franklin Roosevelt's 4 terms. Many democracies have similar provisions. The challenge arises when leaders who have no intention of leaving begin to maneuver around term limits, amending constitutions, engineering favorable court rulings, or staging referendums to reset the clock on their eligibility. Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and numerous African and Latin American leaders have each used variations of this approach to extend their hold on power beyond what the original legal framework allowed. When a leader fights to remove term limits, it is usually a reliable signal of what kind of leader they have become. Economic collapse. A government can survive a great deal, but there are limits to how long it can survive economic ruin. When inflation destroys savings, unemployment spirals, food becomes scarce, and people cannot meet basic needs, the anger that follows has nowhere to go except toward whoever is in charge. Leaders who preside over economic catastrophe tend to fall, though the timing and the mechanism vary. Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe endured years of hyperinflation so severe that the currency became essentially worthless. And yet Mugabe clung to power for decades, before a military intervention finally ended his rule at age 93. Venezuela's leadership survived the country's economic implosion through a combination of oil revenue, repression, and fractured opposition. In other cases, like the fall of governments in Argentina following the 2001 financial crisis, the collapse was swift and the turnover in leadership almost dizzying. Foreign intervention. Sometimes a leader falls not because of internal pressure, but because another country decides to remove them. This can take the form of a full military invasion, covert action, the funding and arming of opposition forces, or the quiet withdrawal of foreign support that was keeping a fragile government standing. The United States orchestrated the removal of Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran in 1953 and Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973. The Soviet Union crushed reformist governments in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. NATO's intervention in Libya in 2011 tipped the balance against Muammar Gaddafi in ways that internal rebels alone could not have achieved. Foreign intervention rarely produces the stable outcome its architects envision. The leader is removed, but what fills the space afterward is frequently chaos, civil war, or a new authoritarian who proves equally difficult to manage. Illness or age. Power does not always end dramatically. Some leaders simply become too old, too ill, or too diminished to continue, and the transition happens gradually rather than in a single rupturing moment. Leonid Brezhnev presided over the Soviet Union's slow stagnation in his final years, while visibly declining in health, delivering slurred speeches, and barely able to function publicly. Francisco Franco of Spain ruled until very near his death at 82, and his final years were marked by a drawn-out physical deterioration that the regime tried to hide from public view. Winston Churchill's second term as prime minister was shadowed by strokes and declining capacity that those around him worked to conceal. The problem with this kind of ending is that it creates a vacuum at the center of power. Decisions go unmade, factions emerge, and the apparatus of government quietly reorganizes itself around the certainty of what is coming. Exile. Exile has been a destination for fallen leaders across centuries. Sometimes it is chosen voluntarily as an alternative to imprisonment or death. Sometimes it is imposed as a condition of leaving power peacefully. Either way, the leader ends up outside their own country, stripped of authority, often dependent on the hospitality of a foreign government. Napoleon was exiled twice, first to Elba, from which he escaped, and then to St. Helena, from which he did not. Idi Amin of Uganda lived out his days in Saudi Arabia after being deposed. Jean-Claude Duvalier spent years in France before controversially returning to Haiti. Ferdinand Marcos fled to Hawaii. The experience of exile tends to preserve a leader's self-image in a way that prison does not. Many exiled leaders spend years insisting that they will return, that they were wronged, that history will vindicate them. Some wait decades. A few actually do go back. Execution. At the far end of the spectrum of downfalls, there is the execution. It happens when the forces that remove a leader decide that letting them live poses too great a risk, or that death is simply the appropriate conclusion to what they represented. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were guillotined as symbols of the old regime. Benito Mussolini was shot by partisans, and his body hung upside down in a Milan square. Nicolae Ceaușescu and his wife were executed by firing squad on Christmas Day 1989, after a summary trial that lasted barely an hour. Muammar Gaddafi was captured by rebel fighters and killed in the street. Saddam Hussein was hanged after a formal legal process that his supporters called a political theater. What unites these endings is their finality and their symbolic weight. The execution of a former leader is meant to close a chapter, to make undeniable the fact that a particular era is over. Whether it actually achieves that closure is another matter entirely. If this video was helpful, please give the video a like and share it with a friend. It's the best way to support the channel and helps us keep creating content like this. Don't forget to subscribe to stay informed, and I'll see you in the next one.